They called him a farmer because that was the easiest way to explain him, a man who once measured his days by the angle of the sun over dry Texas soil, who knew the weight of silence and the patience of waiting. But on a gray morning in Europe, as fog clung low to the hedgerows and the ground trembled with distant artillery, the word farmer meant something else entirely. It meant a man who understood land, who read terrain like a map written by God himself, and who knew when to plant steel instead of seed. The first tank he destroyed did not feel heroic. There was no triumphant music in his head, no rush of glory. There was only the low growl of the engine beneath him, the smell of oil and sweat inside the cramped hull, and the quiet breathing of 3 other men who trusted him without question. They were a crew, not by assignment, but by survival. Driver, gunner, loader, commander, 4 men who learned each other's silences before they learned each other's stories. When the German tank appeared through the mist, its shape almost unreal, like a shadow that had decided to become solid, the Texas farmer did not shout. He did not panic. He raised a hand. The driver eased the Sherman forward, slow, careful, as if coaxing a stubborn tractor through mud. The gunner adjusted by instinct. The loader moved before the order came. And when the shells struck, the world outside vanished in fire. Afterward, there was no cheering, just a brief stillness. The farmer exhaled and looked ahead, already searching for the next threat. War did not allow time for reflection. It only allowed momentum. Word spread quickly, not through newspapers or medals, but through whispers between units. There was a Sherman moving like it had a mind of its own. There was a crew that never broke formation, never hesitated, never abandoned each other. There was a man from Texas who fought tanks the way he once fought drought, patiently, relentlessly, knowing that if you gave the land enough pressure, it would eventually yield. They began to count the days, not because anyone told them to, but because the pace became unreal. One day blurred into the next. Dawn, movement, contact, smoke, silence, then again. German armor rolled forward with confidence, numbers, experience, and again they burned. The farmer learned quickly that tanks were not just machines, they were habits. German commanders favored certain roads, certain tree lines, certain ridges that gave them comfort. Comfort was a weakness. He positioned his Sherman where no one expected a tank to be, Hull, down behind rubble, tucked into orchards, hidden in folds of ground that only someone who had spent a lifetime reading land would notice. His crew stopped asking questions. They trusted his pauses. When he said wait, they waited. When he said move, they moved without hesitation. Their communication became almost invisible, a shift of posture, a glance, a breath held half a second longer than normal. Inside the tank, fear existed, but it was controlled, folded neatly into routine. By the 10th day, the count no longer surprised them. Tanks disabled, tanks destroyed, tanks abandoned in panic as German crews bailed out under fire. Infantry began to avoid the areas where the Sherman was known to operate. Roads emptied. Forest edges stayed quiet for too long. The farmer never spoke of numbers. He spoke of angles, of timing, of patience. He reminded his crew to drink water, to eat when they could, to sleep when the engine finally went quiet. He treated war like work, dangerous work, but work nonetheless, the kind that rewarded discipline and punished carelessness. On the 21st day, they were nearly surrounded. German armor advanced from multiple directions, steel shapes moving with purpose. The radio crackled with fragmented reports, panic leaking through static. Other units pulled back. The farmer did not. He repositioned. He led them through a narrow lane bordered by stone walls, then cut the engine. They waited. Dust settled. Somewhere nearby, engines rumbled. The first German tank rounded the corner and died before its turret could turn. The second tried to reverse and block the third. Smoke filled the lane, screams echoed, and shells punched through steel at point blank range. When it was over, the road was impassable, choked with wreckage. They did not celebrate, they moved. By the 30th day, the crew felt older than their years. Their faces were permanently marked by soot and fatigue. Their hands shook when idle, steady only when working. The farmer noticed everything. He rotated roles when he could, gave the driver extra rest, cracked quiet jokes that never quite reached laughter. He understood that morale was a crop that required constant care. German commanders began to hunt them specifically. Artillery fell heavier where they were suspected to be. Air reconnaissance circled longer. But the farmer adapted. He moved at odd hours. He avoided predictable routes. He used wrecked tanks as cover, turning yesterday's victories into tomorrow's shields. Each engagement sharpened the crew further. The gunner learned to fire on movement alone, recognizing silhouettes through smoke. The loader shaved seconds off every reload. The driver maneuvered the Sherman through impossible terrain, trusting the farmer's voice more than his own eyes. On the 44th day, they lost their sense of time entirely. Only the number remained. The count grew quietly, steadily, almost unreal. German tanks were no longer enemies in the abstract. They were targets. Problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed. Still, fear never vanished. It waited patiently, like a shadow just beyond the edge of thought. It appeared in the moments after combat, when the engine cooled and silence returned. The farmer felt it then. He thought of open fields, of wind through tall grass, of a life where the ground did not shake beneath him. Then he pushed the thoughts away and prepared for the next fight. By the 63rd day, rumors followed them wherever they went. Infantry units asked to fight near them. Others avoided them, believing their presence attracted disaster. The farmer did not care. He accepted orders, studied maps, and chose ground. The 71st day was the hardest. A coordinated German counterattack, armor and infantry moving together, confident and aggressive. The Sherman took hits, metal screamed, paint burned. For the first time, the crew believed they might not leave the battlefield alive. The farmer's voice never rose. He guided them through chaos with calm precision, repositioning, firing, retreating just enough to draw the enemy forward, then striking again. When it ended, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Smoke hung heavy. Wrecked tanks dotted the landscape like rusted monuments. The count climbed again. On the 81st day, the order came, pull back. Rest, refitting required. The farmer nodded as if this was simply another task completed. As they drove away, none of them spoke. The number lingered unspoken between them, heavy and impossible. 258 tanks, 80. 1 days, 1 crew. Later, others would try to explain it. They would call it luck, or skill, or madness. They would reduce it to statistics and reports and faded photographs. But those who had been there understood something simpler. A man who knew land had learned how to fight on it. A crew that trusted each other without question had become something more than 4 men in a tank. And somewhere deep inside the Texas farmer, beneath the soot and the silence, the patience of the fields had followed him into war, teaching him how to wait, how to strike, and how to endure when the world burned around him. When the engine finally went quiet for longer than a few hours, the silence felt wrong. The farmer sat on the hull with his boots dangling, watching smoke drift across a sky that no longer felt like it belonged to any country. Rest was supposed to bring relief, but instead it sharpened memory. The ringing in his ears faded just enough for other sounds to return. Distant gunfire, shouted orders, the clank of tools on armor. War never truly stopped. It only stepped back and waited. The crew stayed close without realizing it. The driver cleaned mud from the tracks again and again, even though they would soon be moving. The gunner dismantled and reassembled his sights with almost religious care. The loader stacked shells neatly, his hands moving with a precision born of repetition rather than calm. None of them spoke much. They did not need to. They had learned each other's rhythms too well to waste words. Commanders came by, curious, respectful, cautious. They asked questions about tactics, positioning, timing. The farmer answered simply. He spoke of slopes, of shadows, of how steel always followed patterns because men did. He never mentioned courage. He never mentioned fear. Those things, he believed, were personal, and war had already taken enough without prying into a man's interior. When the Sherman rolled again, freshly serviced but scarred beyond repair, the farmer felt a familiar weight settle into his chest. The count no longer mattered. Numbers were for after. What mattered was the next ridge, the next tree line, the next stretch of earth that might hide danger or offer protection. The land still spoke to him. Even here, far from Texas, soil was soil, and ground still held truths if you listened closely enough. They were assigned to support advancing infantry this time, slower movement, tighter coordination. More eyes watching for mistakes. The farmer adjusted easily. He positioned the tank where it could see without being seen, covering open ground while infantry crossed in careful bursts. German armor appeared less frequently now, but when it did, it came with desperation rather than confidence. The farmer noticed the change immediately. Tanks moved faster, less cautiously. Shots were taken at poor angles. Retreats turned chaotic. Victory, he understood, was not just about destroying machines. It was about breaking habits, eroding belief. One afternoon, rain fell without warning, heavy and relentless. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The ground turned slick, treacherous. Orders came through the radio to hold position. The farmer listened, then waited. He knew rain. He knew how men behaved when visibility vanished. He shifted the Sherman slightly, just enough to change their angle of engagement. When the German tanks emerged through the downpour, they were already committed. Tracks spun uselessly in mud. Turrets struggled to align. The farmer gave quiet commands. The gun spoke. Steel tore apart. The rain washed blood and oil into the soil, blending them together until neither could be distinguished. That night the crew slept inside the tank, bodies pressed together by necessity rather than comfort. Dreams came in fragments, engines roaring, fields burning, silence stretching too long. The farmer woke before dawn and sat listening to his crew breathe. He felt an unfamiliar ache then, not fear, not exhaustion, but something heavier, responsibility. These men trusted him with their lives, and trust, he knew, was harder to carry than fear. Days folded into weeks again. The count climbed without ceremony. German resistance thinned, but it never vanished entirely. Every destroyed tank was still a reminder that someone else had been inside, someone who believed as fiercely as they did, that he was doing what he must. The farmer did not hate the enemy. Hate required energy he could not spare. He treated them as weather, dangerous and unpredictable, something to be endured and navigated rather than cursed. Once, during a brief lull, the driver asked him what he would do after the war. The question hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. The farmer thought for a long moment before answering. He said he would go back to the land, he would plant again, he would listen to wind instead of engines. The driver nodded, satisfied, as if the answer had confirmed something important. The gunner asked what he would plant first. The farmer smiled faintly and said it would depend on the soil. Combat returned without warning, as it always did. A German armored column attempted to break through a narrow valley, confident in numbers and firepower. The farmer studied the terrain and saw opportunity. He positioned the Sherman where retreat would funnel the enemy forward, turning strength into congestion. When the fight began, it was brutal and close. Shells flew. Metal screamed. Smoke choked the air. The crew functioned like a single organism. Orders were minimal, movements precise. When the last German tank burned, the valley fell silent except for crackling fires. The count rose again, but none of them acknowledged it. They were too tired, too aware that survival was temporary and conditional. As the war pushed onward, the farmer felt the subtle shift that comes near the end of long labor. Resistance weakened, lines broke, rumors of surrender drifted through units like cautious hope. Still, he remained alert. He had learned that danger often grew sharper just before it disappeared. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the wrecked landscape in soft gold, the farmer stood beside his Sherman and ran a hand along its scarred armor. This machine had become more than steel. It was shelter, weapon, witness. He wondered briefly how many lives it had altered, ended, saved. When the final engagements came, they were swift and uneven. German tanks appeared sporadically, often poorly coordinated, sometimes abandoned before the fight even began. The farmer engaged only when necessary. He had nothing left to prove. When the guns finally fell silent for good, the quiet felt unreal. The farmer stood in it and felt smaller than he had in months. Without constant motion, memory rushed in, faces, fire, the weight of decisions made in seconds that had lasted lifetimes. The crew remained together until orders separated them. There were handshakes, quiet nods, a shared understanding that words would cheapen what they had endured. They walked away in different directions, carrying the same invisible weight. Years later, when people spoke of the Texas farmer, they would focus on the number, 258. They would marvel at the statistic, try to dissect it, explain it. But the farmer himself would remember something else entirely: the way land felt beneath steel, the trust in 3 other men, the discipline of patience. And when he returned to his fields, when he pressed seeds into the soil with hands that had once commanded fire, he would feel the earth accept them quietly, without judgment, and he would know that some lessons, once learned, never truly leave you. The war did not end for him when the guns stopped, it simply changed shape. Back in Texas, the land looked familiar but felt distant, like something remembered rather than known. The fields stretched wide and open, untouched by craters or burned steel. Yet when the wind moved through the grass, it carried echoes he could not name. He worked from sunrise to dusk, letting routine do what time alone could not. The soil resisted at first, hard and stubborn, but he understood resistance. He worked with it, not against it, the same way he once had in Europe. Neighbors welcomed him back quietly. There were handshakes that lasted a moment too long, questions that stopped halfway through a sentence. Everyone knew he had been over there. Few knew what that truly meant. The farmer did not correct them. He did not speak of tanks or numbers or days measured in survival. He spoke of rain, of harvest, of how the land had changed while he was gone. At night, sleep came in pieces. Some evenings were peaceful. Others were crowded with sound and heat and the smell of burning oil. When he woke, he would sit on the edge of the bed until the world felt solid again. He learned that patience applied to the mind as much as it did to the soil. Letters arrived occasionally, former crewmen scattered across the country, checking in without saying too much, short notes. Simple words, still here, hope you are too. He kept everyone. They were proof that something real had survived. Years passed. Crops grew and failed and grew again. The farmer aged the way land does, slowly, visibly, without apology. His hands stayed steady, his eyes remained sharp. When younger men asked him about the war, he answered gently and vaguely, steering conversations back toward practical things: how to read clouds, how to tell if soil needed rest, how rushing always cost more in the end. Sometimes, though, he would pause in the middle of a field and feel something tighten in his chest, the memory of a ridgeline, a narrow lane, a valley filled with smoke. He would close his eyes and breathe until the land beneath his boots reminded him where he was. On rare occasions, officials contacted him, ceremonies, recognition, medals offered with practiced smiles. He attended when he felt he must. He stood straight, accepted what was placed in his hands, nodded when names and numbers were spoken aloud. Applause washed over him like distant artillery, loud, impersonal, fading quickly. What mattered to him was not what was said on stages. What mattered were the moments no one recorded, the second before giving an order, the trust in a driver's hands, the quiet relief when all 4 men were still breathing at the end of the day. As decades passed, the story grew larger than the man. Newspapers and books exaggerated, simplified, polished. The Texas farmer became a symbol, a legend, something easier to digest than the truth. He did not correct them. Legends belonged to others. He belonged to the land. In old age, his body slowed, but his mind remained clear. He still rose early. He still walked his fields. He still listened. When his hands finally tired, he sat on the porch and watched the sun move across the sky, measuring time the way he always had. Sometimes children asked him if he had been afraid. He considered the question carefully before answering. He told them fear was like bad weather. It mattered, but it did not decide what needed to be done. When the end came, it was quiet. No engines, no fire, just a slow exhale and the familiar scent of earth nearby. He left behind fields well tended, letters carefully kept, and a story that others would continue to tell in louder voices than his ever had been. And somewhere, Far from the land that shaped him, rusted steel still rested in forgotten valleys, silent and unmoving, while grass slowly reclaimed it, proof that even the loudest violence eventually yields to patience. Long after the last person who had shaken his hand was gone, the habits he carried still moved quietly through the world, in the way certain men paused before making decisions, in the way some crews trusted silence more than shouting, in the way experience passed without ceremony from one generation to the next, unnoticed but intact. A tank instructor once told a class that terrain was everything. He spoke of elevation, cover, concealment. He did not mention the farmer by name, but the lesson carried the same weight. He told them that machines obey physics, but men obey fear, and fear leaves patterns if you watch closely enough. The cadets listened, took notes, nodded. Most would forget the words, a few would remember. In an archive somewhere, a faded combat report sat inside a box marked with numbers and dates. The ink had bled slightly with age. Margins were filled with hurried annotations, corrections, confirmations. It listed destroyed armor, confirmed kills, estimated losses. It said nothing about the pauses between engagements, nothing about the waiting, nothing about the moments when 4 men sat in a steel box, breathing the same stale air, listening to their own hearts slow. The farmer existed between those lines. There were mornings in his later years when he woke before dawn out of habit, even when there was nothing urgent to do. He would sit with a cup of coffee, watching the sky lighten slowly, the way he once watched fog lift from unfamiliar ground. He liked that moment best, when the world was undecided, when nothing had yet demanded action. Sometimes he imagined the crew, then older too, scattered across states and years. He wondered if the driver still listened for engines that weren't there, if the gunner still measured distances instinctively, if the loader's hands still twitched when idle. He hoped they had found peace in ordinary things. He hoped the war had loosened its grip on them faster than it had on him. When he walked his fields, he still chose paths carefully. He avoided low ground after rain. He favored ridges without consciously knowing why. His feet remembered what his mind no longer questioned. The land accepted this without comment. On rare occasions, someone recognized his name, usually younger, usually curious. They spoke excitedly, reverently. They asked him what it felt like to destroy a tank, to survive so many days, to make history. He listened patiently, then answered with something unexpected. He talked about responsibility, about knowing that hesitation could cost lives and recklessness could cost more, about how leadership was less about command and more about restraint. Most left slightly disappointed. That was fine with him. The truth as he understood it was not dramatic. It was quiet and repetitive and heavy. It was choosing the same men every day, again and again, even when fear suggested otherwise. It was understanding that survival was not a victory, but a duty carried forward. As the years continued, memory softened. Sharp edges dulled, some images faded entirely, others remained vivid without warning. The first tank burning, the sound of shells striking armor, the moment of stillness after a fight when the world seemed to hold its breath. These did not haunt him. They simply existed like landmarks on a road already traveled. He never believed he had shaped history. He believed history had passed through him, briefly, the way a storm crosses a field. You endure it, you adapt, you repair what you can afterward. In places where steel once ruled, nature continued its slow work. Moss crept across rusted hulls. Roots pushed through broken metal. Rain smoothed the scars year by year. The land did not remember sides or flags. It remembered pressure, weight, heat, and then it moved on. That knowledge comforted him, because in the end what he trusted most was not recognition or legacy or numbers written on paper. It was the certainty that patience outlasts violence, that discipline leaves fewer ruins, and that even the hardest ground, given enough time, can be returned to something usable. And so the story did not end with medals or silence or final words. It continued in small, ordinary choices made by people who never knew his name, who never counted the tanks, who never stood inside that steel hull. It continued wherever someone chose to wait instead of rush, to observe instead of react, to protect those beside them without needing to be seen. It continued quietly, the way the strongest things always do,